The smell of burning iron clung to my skin, the steady ring of hammer on steel keeping me grounded. But the moment I saw that torn-up love note in the ashes of my forge, I knew my world had already cracked. My name is Elias Griffin. I'm 52 years old, and I make my living the same way my father and grandfather did, by shaping steel into something useful. The forge is more than work. It's legacy. My hands know the weight of a hammer better than they know the feel of a handshake. A man's word means something in iron hollow, and a man's hands tell you everything you need to know about him. I'd been working late that night, finishing up an order for Tom Roberts, one of the local ranchers who still paid in full and on time. The forge fire had burned down to embers when I spotted it. A handful of charred paper mixed with the black dust of my work. The handwriting was familiar Felicity's. I crouched down, picking up a piece that hadn't fully burned. The ink was smudged, but a few words were still legible. I feel alive with you. That was enough. I let the scrap fall back into the ashes and stood, rolling my shoulders. A good man doesn't jump to conclusions. A good man gathers his facts, holds his ground. My father taught me that. But something had already shifted. You don't come back from a discovery like that, no matter how much you want to believe otherwise. I banked the fire, set my tools back in their places, and grabbed my coat. Outside, the night air was sharp, the scent of wood smoke and frost clinging to it. The village was quiet this late, save for the faint murmur of conversation from O'Malley's tavern down the road. My boots crunched on the gravel as I headed home. Felicity was still awake when I walked in, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She looked up, offering the same soft smile she always did. "You're late." I nodded, hanging my coat on the hook. Tom's order took longer than expected. She glanced at the clock. "You should get some rest." I stepped to the sink, ran my hands under the cold water, scrubbing away the soot. "Found something in the forge tonight," I said, keeping my voice even. "Scraps of paper. Looked like one of your notes." There was the briefest hesitation. She set the cup down carefully, like she'd just realized it was too hot. "Must have been something I threw out," she said lightly. "You know I jot things down all the time." I dried my hands, watching her. She held my gaze, but there was something else now, something guarded. I didn't push. "Not yet. I'll be in the shop early tomorrow," I said instead, and walked past her toward the bedroom. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I thought about all the little things I'd ignored. The late nights at the shop. The sudden interest in dressing a little nicer, as if the forge had become an office instead of a place for hard work. The way she'd been quieter lately, distant in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. A man who works with his hands learns to see patterns in things, grain in the wood, stress points in metal. I had a pattern now, and it was leading me to one conclusion. The next day, I went about my work like nothing had changed. That's the thing about steel, it doesn't care about your troubles. You put it in the fire, hammer it into shape, and make it what it needs to be. No emotion. Just work. I took my lunch at O'Malley's, where I ran into my brother, Matthew. He was leaning on the bar, nursing a pint, his face drawn tight. "Didn't think I'd see you out this early," I said, pulling up a stool beside him. Matthew shifted, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "Just needed a drink." He always was the nervous type. The kind of man who let his conscience eat at him. I ordered a black coffee and let the silence stretch. "You all right?" I asked finally. He didn't look at me. "Yeah. Just been thinking about things." I stirred my coffee, watching him. "That's so?" His fingers tapped against his glass. Then, too quickly, he said, "You and Felicity doing okay?" The heat from my coffee seeped into my palms. "Why?" He hesitated. "No reason. Just. I ran into her yesterday. She seemed a little off." Liar. He knew something. I didn't press. Matthew wasn't the kind of man who held up well under pressure. He'd break when he was ready. By the time I got back to the forge, the cold certainty in my gut had settled into something solid. I wasn't wrong. I just needed proof. That night, I tested my theory. Told Felicity I was heading out of town for a supply run. Watched how she reacted. No sadness, no disappointment, just a quick nod and a neutral, "All right." I didn't leave town. Instead, I waited. And when she thought I was gone, I followed. I kept my distance, sticking to the shadows as she made her way toward the far side of the village. Toward Joel Sanders' house. She knocked. The door opened. Joel stood there, dressed in that usual sharp way of his, the kind that said he spent more time in meetings than doing any real work. They didn't see me, but I saw them. Saw the way she looked at him. Saw the way he leaned in, like he'd already won. That was enough. I turned and walked away, my hands curled into fists. The anger burned hot, but I didn't let it take over. No, this wasn't the time for blind rage. This was a time for planning. For control. I had a forge to tend to. And a fire to stoke. The next morning, I went about my work like nothing had changed. The forge fire roared to life as I hammered out an order for the Grayson farm, working the steel with the same steady rhythm I always had. My arms ached. My shirt was soaked through with sweat, but none of it mattered. The work kept me steady. It gave me time to think. The truth was clear now. Felicity and Joel. The late nights, the distant looks, the way she barely reacted when I said I was leaving town. I'd seen them together with my own eyes. But seeing wasn't enough. Not yet. A man who acts without thinking might as well be swinging a hammer blind. You don't hit metal without knowing where the strike will land. Just as I finished up, I heard boots crunch on the gravel outside. I didn't need to look up to know it was Matthew. My brother was nervous, always had been, and he moved like a man who didn't know what to do with himself. He hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "You got a minute?" His voice was tight, like the words were caught in his throat. I wiped my hands on a rag and gestured toward the workbench. "Go ahead." Matthew sat, rubbing his hands together. He swallowed hard. "I need to tell you something, but I don't know how to say it." I leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Then just say it." He looked at me, guilt written all over his face. "It's Felicity," he said quietly. "She's been seeing Joel." I let the silence stretch. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. "You knew," I said finally. Matthew dropped his head. I didn't want to believe it at first. But then I saw them. A few times. I wanted to tell you, but he exhaled sharply. I didn't want to be the one to break it. I studied him. He was telling the truth, at least the part of it that mattered. How long? Couple of months, maybe more. He ran a hand through his hair. I should have said something sooner. You didn't, I finished for him. His jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, Eli. Sorry didn't mean much to me right now. Does anyone else know?" He shook his head. "I don't think so. People talk, but no one said anything outright." I pushed off the table, grabbing a fresh piece of iron from the pile. "Then let's keep it that way." Matthew frowned. "You're not gonna." "I'm not gonna cause a scene if that's what you're asking," I said, placing the iron in the fire. "But I'll handle it." He hesitated. "How?" I didn't answer. Just watched the iron glow hotter. Matthew let out a slow breath and stood. "Just, don't do anything stupid, all right?" I met his eyes. "I don't do stupid, Matt." He gave a short nod, then left. That night, I took a ride out past town. Let the cold air clear my head. I stopped outside St. Mark's, where the old priest, Jonah Jenkins, lived. The man had seen more than his share of human failure, but he didn't preach much these days. I wasn't looking for salvation, but I wanted to hear a man talk who'd seen the worst of people and lived through it. Inside, Jonah sat in his office, a worn Bible in one hand, a bottle of whiskey in the other. He looked up as I stepped in. "Eli," he said, setting the book aside. "Didn't expect to see you here." I pulled out a chair, resting my arms on the table. "Got a question for you." He poured a drink, slid the glass across to me. "Go on. What does a man do when his wife betrays him?" Jonah didn't react, didn't blink. He just took a slow sip of his drink. "Depends on the man." I picked up the glass, rolling it between my fingers. "And what if that man doesn't believe in turning the other cheek?" A wry smile touched his lips. "Then I'd say he's got a decision to make." I took a drink, the burn settling deep. "You ever been betrayed, Jonah?" His eyes darkened for a moment. "More times than I care to count." And he leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "You know what I learned, Eli? People think betrayal happens all at once, but it doesn't. It starts small. A lie here, a look there. By the time you realize it, the knife's already in your back." I nodded slowly. "Sounds about right." He studied me. "You planning on getting even?" I took another sip. "I don't plan on losing." Jonah let out a dry chuckle. "Then I'd say you're ahead of most men." I left soon after, my mind clearer than it had been in days. I didn't need Jonah's permission, just his perspective. Back home, I walked in to find Felicity reading at the kitchen table, a candle flickering beside her. She looked up as I stepped inside. "You were out late," she said. I set my coat on the hook. "Had things to think on." She hesitated, then set her book aside. "Eli, is something wrong?" I met her eyes, searching for any sign of regret, of hesitation. There was nothing. She was good at hiding things. Maybe she'd been doing it for longer than I realized. I shook my head. "Nothing at all." She nodded, standing. "I'm heading to bed. You coming?" "Not yet. Got some things to finish." She lingered for a moment before disappearing down the hall. I sat down, watching the candle flicker, watching the way the wax melted, slow but inevitable. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days passed like nothing had changed. I worked, I ate, I slept. I kept my routine exactly the same, because that's what a smart man does. You don't let the other side know you're onto them. You let them feel safe, let them dig their own grave a little deeper. Felicity was careful, but not careful enough. She still left early for the shop, came home just a little too late, made excuses that I let pass with nothing more than a nod. If she thought I was suspicious, she didn't show it. And Joel? That bastard walked around town like he had nothing to hide, like he hadn't been making a fool out of me. I wasn't a man who reacted. I was a man who built things, who shaped steel into something strong. And now, I was going to shape this situation to my liking. First, I went to Landon Harris, the local judge and an old friend. He'd been around long enough to know the way things worked, and he was one of the few men I trusted. His office was small but clean, the kind of place that told you he ran a tight ship. When I walked in, he was already pouring 2 cups of coffee. "Didn't expect to see you here, Eli," he said, sliding a cup across the desk. "Something on your mind?" I took a sip, letting the silence stretch just enough to make a man uneasy. "Got a legal question for you." Landon raised an eyebrow. "That's so. If a man wanted to make sure his business and property were locked up tight, who'd he talk to?" Landon set his coffee down, leaning forward. "That depends. You worried about something?" "Just making sure things are in order." He studied me. Landon wasn't a fool, and he sure as hell knew better than to press a man like me for details I wasn't offering. "I can put you in touch with someone who can draft whatever paperwork you need. If you're looking to keep certain assets untouchable, well, it's better to do that before anything gets messy." That's what I figured. I finished my coffee and stood. "Appreciate it, Landon." He watched me for a beat. "Eli, whatever this is about, make sure you do it right." I gave him a nod and left. The next step was talking to Tom Roberts, the rancher who owed me a favor. Tom was a man who had ears in every corner of town, the kind of man who could start whispers in the right places. I met him outside Cooper's Supply, where he was loading up sacks of grain into his truck. "Tom," I greeted. "Eli," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What brings you by? I need a favor." He smirked. "Ain't often you ask for those. Won't cost you nothing but a few conversations." Tom set down the sack he was carrying and gave me his full attention. "I'm listening." I kept my voice low. "I need folks to start questioning Joel Sanders' business dealings." Quietly, Tom's eyes sharpened. He wasn't a man who asked unnecessary questions, but he understood how things worked. "You got something on him?" "Let's just say his time in Iron Hollow might be shorter than he planned." Tom nodded, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I can spread some doubts. Nothing solid, just enough to make people uneasy. That's all I need." We shook hands, and I walked away knowing Joel's reputation would start to fray at the edges. A man like him thrived on appearances. If people started losing trust in him, his little empire would crumble fast. That night, I came home late, same as always. Felicity was in the kitchen, washing up after dinner. She turned when she heard me come in. "I kept a plate warm for you," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Appreciate it," I said, setting my gloves on the counter. She hesitated, then leaned against the sink. "Eli, you've been quiet lately." I met her eyes. "I'm a quiet man." She gave a soft chuckle, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, but this is different." I sat at the table, cutting into the steak she'd left for me. "You worried about something?" There it was. The flicker of doubt. "No, just," she forced a small smile. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" I chewed, swallowed, set my fork down. "Would you?" A pause. Just long enough to be telling. "Of course," she said finally. I nodded and went back to eating. I didn't press. I didn't need to. She was already starting to feel the walls closing in. By the time I was done, she'd already gone to bed. I rinsed my plate, dried my hands, then sat down at the kitchen table. The candle flickered in front of me, the flame steady but fragile. Everything was in place. The foundation had been laid. Now, it was time to heat the metal. The next morning, I went about my work as usual, heating iron, shaping it, letting the clang of the hammer drown out the noise in my head. The forge had always been my place of control, where the fire bent to my will and the steel took the shape I gave it. Outside of it, things weren't so simple, but that didn't mean I wasn't in control. The pieces were set, and now it was time to see who would make the first move. By midday, word had already started spreading. Nothing obvious, nothing direct, just whispers in the right corners. I caught pieces of conversation at O'Malley's Tavern when I stopped in for lunch. "You hear about Sanders?" One of the regulars muttered over his beer. "Heard he's been playing fast and loose with his business deals," another said. "Wouldn't be surprised if some of his partners start looking elsewhere." I sat at the bar, eating my stew, saying nothing. Tom Roberts had done his job. Not long after, the door opened, and Joel Sanders walked in, his usual smooth stride just a little too forced. He must have heard the whispers by now. His eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on me, I saw it, hesitation. "Good." He came up beside me, ordering a drink. "Eli," he said, his voice measured. I wiped my mouth with my napkin, set my spoon down. "Joel, been hearing some things," he said casually. "Seems like folks in town have taken an interest in my business." "That's so," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. He turned slightly, lowering his voice. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" I looked at him then, meeting his gaze head-on. "Why would I?" A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he was too smart to let it linger. He forced a smile. "Of course. Just seems like a strange coincidence, is all." I set my cup down. "You know what they say about coincidences, Joel? Usually they ain't that." His jaw tightened, but before he could say anything, Matthew walked in. He spotted me, hesitated, then came over, nodding to Joel. "Afternoon," he said, clearing his throat. Joel gave him a look, then downed the rest of his drink. "I should get going," he said, giving me one last unreadable glance before walking out. Matthew sat down, rubbing his hands together. He looked pissed. "He should be," I said, pushing my empty bowl aside. Matthew shifted, uneasy. "You really going through with this?" I looked at him. "I already have." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Felicity's gonna find out soon. If she hasn't already." "Good." Matthew swallowed hard. "And when she does?" I pushed my chair back, standing. "Then she'll know what it feels like to be on the wrong side of betrayal." That evening, when I walked into the house, Felicity was waiting. She stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, her face carefully composed, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. The air between us was heavy, filled with things left unsaid. "You started this," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. I leaned against the doorway, taking my time. "Started what?" She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "The rumors. The whispers. You think I don't know?" I studied her, watched the way her fingers gripped the edge of the counter. "Didn't have to start anything. Truth has a way of finding its own way out." Her jaw tightened. "This isn't just about you and me, Eli. You're dragging my name through the mud, making me look like. You made yourself look like that." I cut in, my voice even. "You just didn't think anyone would notice." She flinched, but recovered quickly. "And what about Joel? You planning on ruining his life too?" I let a small smile touch my lips. "Looks like he's doing that just fine on his own." Her eyes flashed, anger and something else. Fear, maybe. "You think this makes you the better man?" I stepped closer, my voice dropping just enough to make sure she felt the weight of it. "I think it makes me a man who doesn't roll over and take betrayal like a damn fool." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she shook her head, laughing bitterly. "You know, for years, I waited for you to see me, to actually care about what I needed. But you never did. You were always more comfortable with metal and fire than with me." I studied her, unmoved. "And yet, you stayed." "What?" Her mouth opened, then closed. She had no answer. I nodded. "That's what I thought." I walked past her, leaving her standing there in the kitchen. The walls around her were starting to close in, and soon, she'd have no way out. The only difference was this time, I was the one forging the bars. The next few days passed in slow motion, but the weight of what I'd set in motion was starting to show. Joel kept his head down, and the easy confidence he carried around town was gone. His business was unraveling, partners quietly stepping away, contracts falling through. The whispers had done their work. Felicity wasn't much different. She still moved through the house, still did the things a wife would, but it was mechanical now. I caught her staring off sometimes, lost in thought, like she was waiting for something to break. She knew. Maybe she'd known the second she saw Joel shift uneasily at the shop, or the first time a friend suddenly had nothing to say to her. Matthew came by one evening, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He stood in the forge, hands in his pockets, watching me work. "You done?" he finally asked. I turned the horseshoe in the fire, watching the glow deepen before pulling it out and setting it against the anvil. Done with what? He frowned. Come on, Eli. You proved your point. You made sure everyone knew what they did. You got what you wanted. I set the hammer down, meeting his eyes. Not yet. He sighed. You really think dragging this out is going to fix anything? I don't care about fixing it. Matthew shook his head, shifting his weight. You're going to make her hate you. I huffed a quiet laugh. She already does. He didn't argue. Maybe because he knew I was right. The next morning, I found Felicity sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of her. She wasn't drinking it, just staring down at the surface like it held an answer. I want to talk, she said, voice tight. I poured my own coffee, sat down across from her. Go ahead. She looked at me, really looked, like she was trying to read something in my face. Why are you doing this? I sipped my coffee. Doing what? You know damn well what. Turning everyone against me. Against Joel. I set my cup down, leaning back. Didn't turn anyone. People made up their own minds. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You always were good at that. Making it seem like you didn't do a damn thing while you pulled the strings. I said nothing. She wasn't wrong. She exhaled sharply, gripping the cup tighter. Do you even care? About any of it? About me. I watched her, measured my words. I care that you made a choice. And now you live with it. She flinched, just barely, but enough. Her fingers drummed against the ceramic, restless, frustrated. We could have just ended it clean. I let that sit between us. You could have told me, I said finally. If you wanted to leave, you could have said it. Her jaw tightened. Would you have let me? I tilted my head. Don't make it sound like I had you in chains, Felicity. You stayed. Right up until you didn't. She looked away, out the window. I loved him, she admitted, almost too quietly to hear. I didn't react. Didn't flinch. Just watched her. And now? I asked. Her lips pressed together, her hands curling into fists. She didn't answer. I nodded, standing up. Then I guess you got what you wanted. I left her sitting there, her hands gripping a cup that had long since gone cold. Felicity didn't say much after that. She still moved through the house, still acted like things were normal, but the silence between us was heavier than ever. She didn't ask where I was going, didn't ask what I was doing. Maybe she figured she didn't have the right anymore. Word around town was that Joel was on his way out. His business was falling apart, his partners pulling back. He tried to fight it, tried to hold on, but the damage had been done. You can't build something in a place like Iron Hollow without trust, and once that was gone, so was your foundation. I went to the forge early that morning, letting the fire burn hotter than usual, the glow of it casting long shadows across the walls. The door creaked open behind me, and I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Matthew stepped inside, shoving his hands into his pockets. You hear about Joel? I kept my focus on the piece of metal I was shaping. What about him? He's leaving. Packed up his office, trying to sell what he can before he skips town. I nodded, flipping the metal and bringing the hammer down hard. Figured it'd happen sooner or later. Matthew exhaled, shaking his head. You really gonna let it end like this? I set the hammer down, wiping the sweat from my forehead. How else should it end? He shifted, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Felicity, she's not doing too good. I looked at him. Not my problem. She's still your wife. I met his eyes, steady. Not anymore. Matthew ran a hand through his hair, letting out a breath. So that's it. You just walk away. I picked up the metal, examining it. I didn't walk away, Matt. She did. He didn't have an argument for that. By evening, the house was quiet. Felicity had been in the bedroom most of the day, leaving her food untouched, moving like a ghost through the place that used to be hers. I sat at the kitchen table, the single candle flickering in front of me, watching the wax drip down slow. I heard her footsteps before she spoke. Eli. I didn't look up. Felicity. She pulled out a chair across from me but didn't sit. I'm leaving. I nodded once. Figured. Her hands gripped the back of the chair, knuckles white. You don't care. I finally looked at her. What do you want me to say? She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. I don't know. Something. Anything. I leaned back, crossing my arms. You made your choice. You don't get to be mad at me for not fighting to keep you. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. You leaving with him? I asked, voice steady. A hesitation. Then a quiet, no. I studied her, watching the way she shifted her weight, how her fingers curled around the wood of the chair like she needed something solid to hold on to. You thought he'd wait for you, I said. She swallowed hard. I thought a lot of things. Silence stretched between us. Finally, she straightened, clearing her throat. I'll be gone in the morning. I nodded, standing up, blowing out the candle. Good. I left her there in the dark, the sound of my boots the only thing that filled the space between us. Felicity was gone by sunrise. She didn't leave a note, didn't try for any last words. Just packed what she could fit in the old sedan and drove off. I stood at the window with my coffee, watching the dust settle long after she disappeared down the road. No sadness, no relief, just the weight of something ending. By noon, I was back in the forge. Work didn't stop just because a marriage did. The fire burned, the hammer rang out, and my hands did what they'd always done. Shape steel, shape something solid, something that wouldn't bend or break under pressure. The town moved on too. People whispered about Joel's sudden departure, how he'd sold off what he could before leaving town with nothing but a suitcase and a reputation in ruins. A man like him couldn't recover from that. He built everything on perception, and once that cracked, there was nothing left to hold him up. Matthew stopped by a few days later, standing in the doorway of the forge, looking at me like he wasn't sure if he should say something. It's over, he finally muttered. I set down the hammer, rolling my shoulders. Yeah. He shifted. You all right? I met his eyes, steady. I'm still here. That was enough. A week passed, then two. The house was quieter now, emptier in a way I hadn't expected. But I didn't mind it. Some things were meant to be burned away, and what was left standing after was what truly mattered. One evening, I stopped by O'Malley's for a drink. The bar was warm, filled with the low hum of conversation, the clink of glasses. A few heads turned as I walked in, nods of respect from men who knew what had happened and knew how I handled it. No pity, no questions, just acknowledgement. Landon Harris was there, nursing a whiskey, and he smirked when I sat down beside him. You made it through. I took a slow sip of my own drink. Always do. He chuckled, shaking his head. Damn shame about Joel. I raised a brow. Is it? He laughed, taking another drink. Guess not. There wasn't much left to say. The work had been done, the steel had been tempered, and what remained was stronger than before. By the time I got home, the night was still, the kind of quiet only Iron Hollow knew. I walked inside, lit a candle, and sat at the table. The house was empty, but it wasn't hollow. It was mine again. I pulled the old ring from my pocket, Felicity's wedding band, the one she'd left behind without a second glance. It sat heavy in my palm, a useless piece of metal now. But metal could be reforged. I stood, walked out to the forge, and tossed it into the fire. The gold melted, swallowed up by the heat, just another thing consumed by flames. I picked up my hammer and got back to work.